I lost my best friend the day I retired. Not to death, not to distance, not to any falling out or argument or the kind of slow drift that happens between people who stop making the effort. I lost him in a way that took me a long time to even recognize as a loss, because what I lost was not a person exactly, but the version of myself that he had known for 35 years. The version that showed up every morning with something to contribute, something to say, something that mattered to the people in the room. My best friend was the work. I know how that sounds. I know it sounds like the confession of a man who got his priorities wrong, and maybe it is. Maybe that is exactly what it is. But I want to be honest about it rather than dress it up into something more flattering, because the honest version is the only version that does anybody any good. For 35 years, the work was the thing I woke up for. The thing that organized my days and gave my mind something real to chew on and put me in rooms with people who needed what I had and who let me know, in the daily and unremarkable way that a functioning professional life communicates these things, that I was somebody worth listening to. And then I retired, and the work ended, and I discovered that I had not just lost a job. I had lost the friend that had been keeping me company inside my own head since I was 29 years old. The morning I understood this, really understood it, and not just suspected it, I was sitting on the back porch of my house in Knoxville, Tennessee, with a mug of coffee that had gone cold, because I had been sitting there long enough for that to happen, without noticing, watching the tree line at the back of the yard in the early morning light, and I felt the quiet in a way that was different from any quiet I'd ever felt before. Not peaceful quiet, not the earned quiet of a man who has worked hard and is resting well. This was the quiet of a house where something used to live that does not live there anymore. And I sat with it for a long time that morning, trying to figure out what in the world I was supposed to do next. I spent 35 years working as a high school history teacher and football coach at the same school in Knoxville, Tennessee. And I want you to understand something about what that means before you form any picture of it in your head, because the picture most people form when they hear high school teacher is not the picture that matches what that work actually felt like from the inside, for a man who gave everything he had to it for the better part of 4 decades. Teaching is not a job the way that other jobs are jobs. It does not clock out at 3:15 when the last bell rings, and it does not stay at the office over the weekend, and it does not leave you alone in the evenings when you are trying to eat dinner and not think about work, because the work is not a set of tasks that can be completed and set aside. It is a set of relationships with human beings who are at the most complicated and consequential stage of their lives, and who require your attention and your genuine investment, not on a schedule but on the schedule that their lives in will require your attention, and your genuine investment, not on the schedule, but on the schedule that where porjway time and your prosbandmees are there. I understood this going in, or I thought I did, and I accepted it willingly because teaching was not something I fell into for lack of better options. It was something I chose deliberately at 23 years old, after 2 years of trying other things and finding them hollow in a way I could not fully articulate at the time, but that I understand completely now, which was that they did not require enough of me, did not ask me to bring the whole of myself to the work, and I had always known somewhere in the back of my mind that I was the kind of person I grew up in East Tennessee, the son of a man who drove a delivery truck for 30 years and a mother who worked part-time at a fabric store and raised 3 boys in a small house in a working-class neighborhood where nobody had a whole lot but everybody showed up for each other in the particular way of communities that have not yet been persuaded that self-sufficiency is the highest virtue. My father was not an educated man in the formal sense, but he was one of the most genuinely intelligent people I have ever known, a man who read voraciously and thought carefully and had opinions about history and politics and human nature that were worth listening to, and I think the combination of his intellectual curiosity and the economic circumstances that had prevented him from doing much with it formally planted something in me early about the value of education and about what it meant to give young people access to the kind of thinking that could expand the boundaries of the world they had been balls out. I started at Riverside High School in the fall of my 29th year. hired to teach American and world history to juniors and seniors, and I also took on the assistant coaching position for the varsity football team because I had played in college, and the head coach at the time, a man named Pete Garfield, who became one of the most important people in my professional life, had heard about my background and made the offer, and I had said yes without much deliberation because I understood instinctively that coaching was another form of the same work, the work of being genuinely present with young Poit and more. My wife Linda had grown up in Knoxville and had her own career as a nurse at the university hospital, steady and demanding work that she was exceptionally good at and that kept her as fully occupied as my teaching kept me, and we had built our life in a neighborhood about 4 miles from the school in a house we bought when our son James was 2 years old, and that we were still living in 33 years later when I retired. The same house with the same back porch and the same tree line that I would eventually sit in front of on a cold morning trying to figure out where my sense of purpose had gone. James grew up in that house and went to Riverside himself, which meant that for 4 of his high school years I was both his father and his history teacher and one of his football coaches, a situation that required a delicacy that neither of us always managed perfectly, but that produced something between us that I value enormously, a knowledge of each other that most fathers and sons do not get, because they do not spend that many hours in the same institutional context watching each other operate under pressure. I became head football coach when James was a sophomore, Pete Garfield having retired the previous spring after 22 years, and the job came with a different kind of visibility and a different kind of pressure than the assistant role had carried, the kind of pressure that is generated by a community that cares about its team and that communicates its caring in ways that are sometimes warm and sometimes considerably less than warm depending on the scoreboard. I coached for 11 years as head coach, won 2 state championships and lost a lot more games than I won in the early years, and learned more about leadership and about the particular psychology of teenage boys under stress than any graduate program could have taught me. And I loved it with the specific and uncomplicated love that you have for things that are genuinely hard and that ask the best of you on a regular basis. The classroom was where my heart lived, though. And I want to be clear about that because I think the coaching tends to dominate the story when people hear it, and the teaching was always the primary thing, always the reason I was there, and the work that I thought about most carefully and that I measured myself against most honestly. I taught the same subjects for 35 years, and they never got old because the students were never the same. Each class a different collection of human beings with different histories and different relationships to the material and different needs and different ways of being reached. And the challenge of finding the approach that worked for this particular group of young people in this particular year was a puzzle that renewed itself every September, and that I never entirely solved, which is, I think, the definitory substituting of what for you. I want to tell you about the picture I had built up in my head about what retirement was going to look like, because I think the picture matters, and I think it is worth examining honestly, because the gap between the picture and the reality is where most of the difficulty I am about to describe actually lived. The picture had been forming for years, not because I was eager to leave the work. I was not. I loved the work right up until the last day, and probably beyond it, but because the physical demands of the job had been accumulating in my body in ways I could no longer ignore by the time I was in my mid-60s. And the picture of retirement had become a way of making peace with the necessity of something I would not have chosen purely on preference. I had a bad knee from 30 years of standing on hard floors and pacing sidelines in all weather, a lower back that made its opinions known every morning with an insistence that had been getting harder to argue with, and a level of accumulated fatigue that I had been carrying for so long that I had stopped recognizing it as fatigue, and had started accepting it as just the baseline condition of being the age I was and doing the work I was doing. When my doctor told me at 64 that I was running on fumes and that my body was going to start making the retirement decision for me if I did not make it myself, I heard him and I took him seriously, and I started allowing myself to think about the picture with more seriousness than I had previously permitted. In the picture, I was rested in a way I had not been rested since before I started teaching. The deep and genuine rest of a body that has finally been given permission to stop running at full speed. And that is taking that permission seriously. I imagined sleeping past 6 for the first time in 3.5 decades, waking up without the immediate forward lean of a man who has a first period class at 7:45, and a film session with the linebackers at 6:30 in the morning, and a department meeting at lunch and parent-teacher conferences in the evening, and a stack of essays that needed grading before tomorrow. I imagined mornings that belonged entirely to me, slow and unhurried and free from the institutional rhythm that had organized every weekday of my adult life since my late 20s. Linda and I had talked about travel, the real kind, not the quick weekend trips. They were all the school calendar had ever really allowed, but extended travel, 2 or 3 weeks at a stretch, going to places we had always wanted to go, and staying long enough to actually absorb them, rather than just checking them off a list. We had talked about driving the Blue Ridge Parkway in the fall, about going to Ireland because Linda's family had roots there, and she had always wanted to see where they came from, about spending a month in the American Southwest, because neither of us had spent real time in that landscape, and we had both been reading about it for years, and feeling the pull of it in the way that certain places pull at you before you have ever been to them. I was going to read for pleasure in a sustained and unhurried way for the first time since graduate school, working through the long list of books that had been accumulating on the nightstand, and the mental list that lived alongside it of things I had always intended to read when I had the time, and that the 35 years of teaching and coaching had never quite made room for. I had a particular interest in deep narrative history, the kind that reads like a novel and that goes below the surface of events into the human texture of them, and I imagined long afternoons in the armchair in the study, with a good book and the afternoon light coming through the window and nowhere to be until dinner. I was going to spend more time with James and his family, James having married a woman named Beth, who was warm and smart, and who had given Linda and me 2 grandchildren, a boy named Cooper, who was 8, and a girl named Avery, who was 6 at the time. I retired, and I had a very specific picture of the kind of grandfather I was going to be, the kind who was genuinely available on a Tuesday afternoon, who could pick them up from school and take them to the park and teach Cooper to throw a spiral and read to Avery in the evenings, when James and Beth needed a break, the cred and unheard grafter that had not did dot babe. I also had a quieter and more private set of expectations that I did not talk about much but that were real and that I held on to in the way you hold on to things that feel slightly too hopeful to say out loud, which was the expectation that retirement was going to give me back something of myself that the job had been consuming for 35 years, some interior space and some personal time and some freedom to follow my own thoughts where they led, rather than always pointing them in the direction that the next class or the next craft or the next game required. The retirement dinner was held at a restaurant near the school that the faculty had organized, about 60 people, colleagues and former students and parents and community members who had been part of the Riverside world during my years there, and it was one of the warmest evenings of my life. I want to say that clearly, an evening full of genuine affection and specific memory, and the kind of accumulated goodwill that can only be built over decades of showing up and caring about what you are doing, and about the people you are doing it, and for. Several former students spoke, young men and women who were now in their 30s and 40s, and who said things about what the classroom had meant to them, and what the coaching had meant to them, that I received with a gratitude that I am not sure I fully expressed in the moment, because I was working hard to keep it together and not entirely succeeding. Linda held my hand through most of it, and I was glad she was there, and glad that she had been there for all of it. The 35 years of early mornings and late nights, and the times when the job had taken more than its fair share, and the times when it had given back in ways that made the taking worthwhile. I drove home that night feeling full in every sense of the word, full of the evening and the warmth of it, and the genuine sense of having done something that mattered. And I told myself that the next chapter was going to be good, was going to be the reward that the 35 years had earned, and I believed it completely and without reservation, and I held on to that belief all the way through the first week of retirement and well into the second, before the first small cracks began to appear in it. The first crack showed up on the Monday morning, about 3 weeks into retirement, and it showed up in the most ordinary and undramatic way imaginable, which is, I think, how the important things usually announce themselves. Not with any fanfare, but with the quiet insistence of something that has been true for a while and that is only now being noticed because the noise that was covering it has finally gone away. I woke up at 6:15, the body refusing, as always, to accept that the alarm was no longer necessary. And I lay there in the bedroom in the early morning gray and waited for the familiar forward lean of a man with a first period class to get to and a coaching staff meeting before that. And the forward lean did not come. What came instead was a flatness, a low and oddly specific absence of the pole that had gotten me vertical every weekday morning for 35 years, and I lay there longer than I needed to, and longer than felt comfortable, staring at the ceiling and listening to the house and trying to locate inside myself the enthusiasm for the day that I had always assumed would be there once the job was no longer crowding it out. Linda was already up. I could hear her in the kitchen below, and the smell of coffee was coming up the stairs in that particular way it does in an old house with good air circulation, and I got up eventually and went downstairs and poured a cup and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the backyard in the early light and tried to figure out why the morning felt wrong when everything about it was technically fine. Linda left for the hospital at 7, her shifts starting early the way hospital shifts do, and the house went quiet in a way that I had not experienced on a weekday morning in longer than I could remember, a complete and total weekday quiet that was different in quality from the weekend quiet I was accustomed to, heavier somehow, more pointed. The quiet of a Monday morning in a house where a man used to have somewhere important to be and no longer does. I drank my coffee and read the newspaper all the way through for the first time in years, actually read it rather than scanning it in the 10-minute window between breakfast and leaving, and the reading of it was pleasant enough, but it was done by 8:15, and the day stretched out ahead of me in a way that I found disorienting, in a manner I had not anticipated. September had just started, and I knew without being able to stop myself from knowing that right now, at this exact moment, the students were filing into first period at Riverside, and somebody else was standing at the front of my classroom doing what I had done on the first Monday of every September for 35 years, and the knowing of it sat in my chest in a way that was uncomfortable and that I told myself firmly was just adjustment, just the expected strangeness of a transition, just a man's system taking time to recalibrate after 3.5 decades of the same rhythm. I went out to the garage and puttered around for a while, which is what I had started doing in the mornings when the house got too quiet, moving things around and looking at the workbench and the tools that I had accumulated over the years, with the vague intention of doing more with them than I had ever actually done. And the puttering helped marginally in the way that any physical activity helps when you are trying to outrun something you do not entirely want to sit with. The phone was a second sign, and it hit me in a different way than the quiet mornings, more sudden and more specific. During the school year, my phone had been a constant and sometimes maddening presence. Texts from assistant coaches and emails from parents and messages from the athletic director and calls from colleagues, and the general unrelenting connectivity of a school community that operates at a pace and a volume that you stop fully registering after enough years of immersion in it. 3 weeks into retirement, the phone was sitting on the kitchen counter with the particular stillness of an object that nobody needs. A few colleagues had reached out in the first days, warm and well-meaning messages, "Enjoy it, you earned it, and let us know when you want to come watch a practice," and I had responded to all of them with genuine warmth and meant it when I said, "Yes, let's get together." And then the getting together had not happened, and the messages had slowed to nothing, and the phone was just sitting there, and I was checking it with a frequency that I recognized as the habit of a man who was used to being needed, and who had not yet found a way to be comfortable with not being needed. Whether to bada Wednesday afternoon, the wendo la tamturns, vaticanada bada Wednesday, the rendo buffert, Rudigada bada when so to the Rensivend, what ensenada sebald, red hine, Susan Redding, what a buddy of pouting and men ruddet, and a thousand ton of building and looked at the practice field where the team was running drills in the afternoon heat, and I stood heat, and I could see from the road the particular organized chaos of a football practice, the groups moving through their stations and the coaches moving among them with the purposeful energy of men who have somewhere witamend, the drive aounds, one at what it best debat, but it what with this budache. I drove home and did not mention it to Linda because it seemed like the kind of thing that would worry her unnecessarily, and also because saying it out loud would make it more real than I was ready for it to be. And I made dinner, and we ate together, and watched something on television, and the evening was warm and easy in the way our evenings had always been. And I told myself again that it was just adjustment, just the natural and expected difficulty of a major transition, and that it would sort itself out, given enough time. What I did not tell myself, because I was not yet ready to hear it, was that what I was feeling was not just the absence of a routine, but the absence of an identity, and that those two things were going to require very different responses, and that the response I was currently deploying, which was patience and the assumption that time would handle it, was going to prove considerably less adequate for the second than for the first. It came to me at a football game, which I suppose makes a certain kind of sense, given how much of my adult life had been organized around football games. How many Friday nights I had spent on sidelines in all kinds of weather, in the heat of early September, and the genuine cold of late November playoffs, and how completely the rhythm of the football season had structured not just my professional life, but the interior calendar of my whole adult existence. It was the third game of the season, a home game at Riverside, and one of my former assistant coaches had called me the week before and told me to come out, told me the boys would love to see me and that there was a seat reserved for me in the press box if I wanted it, and I had said yes without much hesitation because I genuinely wanted to be there and because the games had always been one of the purest pleasures of the coaching life, that particular combination of strategy and execution and human drama that a good football game provides, and I had never gotten tired of 35 years of standing on sidelines watching unfold. I drove to the stadium on that Friday night in late September with a feeling that was close to the old pre-game feeling, the particular alertness and forward orientation that game nights had always produced in me, and I parked in the lot and walked across to the stadium in the cooling evening air with the lights already blazing above the field and the sound of the band warming up and the smell of the concession stand and the particular energy of a Friday night crowd gathering, all of it so familiar and so deeply embedded in my sensory memory that for a few minutes walking across that parking lot, I felt almost entirely like myself, like my Matt had bitted it for 40. I got to the press box, and my former assistant coach, a young man named Danny Briggs, who had been with me for 6 years and who is now the offensive coordinator, greeted me with genuine warmth and introduced me to the new head coach, a 38-year-old named Coach Harlan, who had come from a school in Nashville and who shook my hand with the respectful deference that a new coach extends to a predecessor, and I liked him immediately, and felt genuinely glad that the program was in capable hands, which was something I had worried about more than admitted to any mote. The game started, and I watched it from the press box with the focused attention of a man who cannot turn off 35 years of analytical habit, seeing the things that coaches see, the tendencies and the mismatches and the adjustments that needed making. And there were moments in the first half when I had to physically stop myself from reaching for a headset that was not there and was not mine to reach for anymore. That physical impulse, the automatic reach for the headset, was the first piece of what was coming. At halftime, I went down to the field level to get some water, and several of the players recognized me and came over, boys. I had coached as freshmen and sophomores who were now juniors and seniors, and they greeted me with the particular mix of affection and slight awkwardness that teenagers bring to interactions with adults from their lives who have moved into a different category. No longer authority figures exactly, but not quite civilians either. Something in between that nobody has a clean social script for. One a teenia, one a barcade named courting bargaining, that body would modest. I'd boarding hen courting read abortion, one not event sorry and what is in frame portium, I would bunson, and I said fine, great, really enjoying a time off, which wine. And I said, fine, great, really enjoying the time off, which was the answer I always gave. And Tyler nodded and said that was cool, and then his eyes moved past me to where Coach Harlan was standing with the offensive staff, going over adjust him. And Addy would date, and there I came out at sound, dote to me doot, but tadicoat. But the body would tried it. What I felt watching Tyler jog back to his coaches was not jealousy of Coach Harlan, and not resentment of the new staff, and not any of the petty emotions that might have been easier to manage. What I felt was the specific and vertiginous sensation of understanding, for the first time with my full adult clarity rather than just as an abstract awareness, that I was no longer the person those boys looked to, not because anything had gone wrong, not because I had failed or been replaced against my will, simply because I had retired, and the world had continued, and the boys who needed a coach had a coach, and the coach was not me, and the me that it existed in relation to those boys and that sideline and that program for 35 years was gone in a way that was complete and final, and that all the warm greetings and reserved press box seats in the world could not change or soften or reverse. I drove home after the game. Riverside had won by 2 touchdowns, and I was genuinely glad about that, and Linda was already in bed, and the house was quiet, and I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, the way I had been doing with increasing frequency when something was working its way through me that I needed to sit with rather than move past. I to which it would tie for a cab, at the nitu simid come 7, at what time or abios and wishin ram. I thought about a fetas me to ivrams and me to win toward at those kids. The fact that there was a ozo's new group coming in September, always a do is covered the gid. The fact that there was always a new group coming in September, always a new set of young Peterbill, who need to attend. As to jibbid then, boo betimed as me to veil. That betimed deferred rose group in ways I would have to figure out and respond as bear deal. Either W would be the card to beta. I want to try to describe what the days actually looked like during that period. The specific and unglamorous texture of them, because I think the honest description is more useful than the broad strokes, and because anyone who has been through something similar will recognize the details in a way that the summary does not allow for. I was not falling apart in any visible or dramatic sense, and I want to be clear about that, because I think the story of a man struggling with retirement can sound from the outside like a man who is failing to be grateful for something good, and that framing is both inaccurate and unhelpful. Because what I was experiencing was not ingratitude, and it was not weakness, and it was not the complaint of a man who had everything and was finding reasons to be dissatisfied with it. What I was experiencing was the specific and genuine difficulty of a man whose entire internal architecture had been built around a particular kind of daily engagement, and who was now living in the absence of that engagement and finding the absence considerably more structural than he had anticipated. The mornings were the hardest part of the day, and I say that with the precision of a man who spent a lot of time paying attention to his own experience during that period, because there was not a great deal else competing for his attention. I would wake up between 6 and 6:30 out of pure biological memory, the body still keeping the old school schedule regardless of what the calendar said, and I would lie there in the bedroom and wait for the day to present itself with some kind of organizing principle, some reason to get up and get moving with the particular purposeful energy that 35 years of first period classes and early morning coaching sessions had made the default setting of my mornings. The reason did not come. What came instead was the day in its raw and unorganized form. A collection of available hours with no particular claim on them and no particular structure to move through. And I would get up and make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and look at the backyard and try to figure out what I was going to do with myself until Linda came home from the hospital in the late afternoon. I started taking long walks in the mornings, partly because the doctor had been telling me for years that I needed more regular, low-impact exercise for the knee and the back, and partly because the walking gave the first hour of the day a shape it otherwise lacked and got me out of the house and into the neighborhood where at least the world was visibly in motion, even if I was not a functional part of its motion. I would walk the same route most mornings, down Maple Street and through the park on the East End, and back up through the neighborhood behind ours, about 45 minutes if I kept a decent pace, and the walking was genuinely good for me physically, in ways I could feel and that the doctor confirmed at my next checkup. But the walking was over by 8:30, and the day was still mostly in front of me, and the problem of what to do with it had not been solved by the 45 minutes of forward motion, just deferred. I watched more television than I had watched in my entire adult life combined, which I recognized as a symptom of something even as I was doing it, and that I continued doing anyway because the alternative, which was sitting in the quiet house with nothing between me and the awareness of how slowly the hours were moving, felt worse than whatever the television was doing to my self-image. As a man who had always been productively occupied, I watched morning news and afternoon sports programming and documentaries in the evenings, and I retained very little of any of it because I was not really watching. I was using the screen as a way to make the room feel less empty, which worked marginally and temporarily and left me feeling vaguely diminished in a way that I could not entirely shake even when I told myself about it. The absence of the students was the thing that surprised me most, which sounds obvious in retrospect, but did not feel obvious at the time, because I had thought about missing the coaching more than I had thought about missing the classroom, and it turned out to be the other way around. Football season ended in November, and the missing of the sideline eased somewhat after that, or at least changed quality, became more of a background ache than a foreground one. But the missing of the classroom did not ease, did not change quality, did not settle into something more manageable as the months went on. I missed the specific daily experience of standing in front of a room full of young people and watching them encounter an idea for the first time. Missed the particular kind of attention that a classroom requires, the constant reading of the room and the real-time adjustment of approach based on what the faces in front of you are telling you about whether you are reaching them or losing them. I miss the arguments, the genuinely good arguments that high school juniors and seniors will have about history when they are given the space and the encouragement to have them. The moments when a student would push back on something I had said with a point I had not considered, and the class would collectively lean in, and the thing that I had set out to teach them would become something more alive and more genuinely interesting than I had planned for it to be. I missed being corrected by 17-year-olds, which is something I never thought I would say, but that I mean completely, because being corrected by a 17-year-old with a good point is one of the most energizing experiences a teacher can have, and I had been having it regularly for 35 years, and I had not fully understood what it was giving me until it was no longer available. Linda was patient with me during this period in a way that I want to acknowledge clearly and with the gratitude it deserves, because I was not easy to live with in the specific way that a man is not easy to live with when he is struggling with something he has not yet found the words for, and that is therefore expressing itself as a general low-grade restlessness and dissatisfaction that fills the house without ever quite attaching to any specific complaint that could be addressed directly. She did not push me to talk about it before I was ready, and she did not offer unsolicited solutions, and she did not minimize what I was going through by comparing it to harder things or reminding me of how fortunate I was, all of which would have been understandable responses and none of which would have helped. And the restraint she showed in not doing those things was a form of love that I recognized and was grateful for, even when the gratitude was sitting underneath a layer of difficulty that made it hard to express properly. That traba junjuria the jurt of diabla parade of Brumard, Sapha bitter be the britteraments, Viram with the road, when in the radia travan, one an as a maiderish. When of our crabadivian, Burban beta of aids, mine a bit came in those hours, were not castifical or despairing. I want to be precise about that, but they were honest in the unsoftened way that thoughts are wrought is mot. What they wit, which who it pretending to is the question of what that. But they were honest in the one softened way, but thoughts of aren't, between mordit. You wet big its route, but once out they taught, but you all into it blamed. But to be walked, but it would divided, but a bedoed, but it there is a particular kind of honesty that becomes possible when the forward motion stops and the quiet settles in, and there is nothing left to do but sit with the actual record of a life, rather than the version of it you have been carrying in your head, the version that has been edited by the same forward motion that prevented you from looking too closely at it while you were inside it. Retirement gave me that honesty whether I was ready for it or not, and what I found when I sat with the actual record was not a life badly lived. I want to be clear about that, but a life that had specific and recurring costs that I had been paying without fully acknowledging the currency I was using to pay them, and the acknowledgement of those costs was something I owed to the people who had absorbed them on my behalf for 35 years, without being formally asked to do so. The first and most honest thing I have to say is about James, my son, and about the particular shape of my presence in his life during the years when his presence in mine was most visible and most continuous. The years when he was growing up in our house and going to our school and playing on my team and sitting in my classroom, years that sound from the outside like a period of exceptional father-son closeness and that were, in some ways, exactly that, and in other ways something more complicated than that. James and I were close in the way that a father and son are close. When they spend a lot of time in the same institutional context, when they eat lunch in the same cafeteria and share the same schedule, and the son knows his father in the professional dimension with an intimacy that most kids never have access to. James knew how I ran a practice and how I handled a difficult parent and how I treated the kid on the scout team who was never going to start but who showed up every day and gave everything he had, and he respected what he saw. He told me so years later in a conversation that I hold on to, and I am genuinely glad that he had that window into who I was at work, because I think it gave him something real and specific to measure his own professional conduct against as he grew into a man. But James also knew, with the same intimacy and from the same close range, that his father's attention was divided in a way that a less visible job would have made easier to obscure, that the son of the head football coach at Riverside High School was always partly the coach's son in a way that carried its own particular weight, that there were Friday nights when the game was more present to me than the boy standing next to me on the sideline, and that the teacher in me sometimes showed up at the kitchen table when what was needed was just the dad. The ready brady brazu shuchitin the ratum abaradamic bidium argi abaricasm libidiumnas. That muddy predels but the balsamos emperor gopatiavasin with the defensive backs and bots in my head would it free predelbuit sipiabertus, but tarted balston they did betam sucrilus farms and bid the defense and boss. He fund benished the biopuras. And did we predel to be at the negapachid abovivant, a fatal pilmachir therent. Pretend to do it a build in bansum. The Pachanda bekend do about the Pekinser real bidiats. Whipped biddy by Puchimbidabil. Picked Kidipton but big water. James is a good man and a good father to Cooper and Avery, and he turned out well in every way that matters. And our relationship now is warm and real, and I am grateful for it every day. But I know that the warmth of it was built partly by Linda and partly by James himself, and only partly by me. And the knowing of that is part of the honest record that retirement has made me sit with. Linda is the other place where the honest accounting settles with the most weight, and I want to talk about her carefully, because she is the best person I know, and because what I have to say is not a criticism of her or of our marriage, which has been genuinely good, and which I value beyond my ability to express it adequately, but an honest acknowledgement of what I asked of her, for 35 years without always recognizing that I was asking. Linda built her life around the edges of my schedule for 3.5 decades, not because she was required to and not because she lacked the capability or the ambition to build it differently, but because we had made a set of implicit agreements early in the marriage about how the household would function and whose career would take priority in the logistical negotiations that two working parents are constantly conducting. And those agreements had settled in my favor in ways that I accepted without adequate examination because the accepting was easy and the examining was not. She arranged her hospital shifts around the football schedule for 11 years, so that there would always be a parent available for James on game nights when I was on the sideline. She handled the parent-teacher conferences for James's teachers, the ones I should have attended but that conflicted with my own conferences, or with practice schedules, going alone and relaying the information to me later, with a matter-of-factness that made it easy to receive without fully registering what it had cost her to manage alone. She managed the house and the finances and the social calendar and the maintenance schedules and the relationships with our extended families, with a competence and a consistency that I benefited from enormously and acknowledged insufficiently, and I know this now with a clear and slightly uncomfortable honesty of a man who has had enough quiet time to look at the actual distribution of labor in his marriage and to see it without the softening that busyness always provided. She has never said any of this to me in the form of a complaint or an accusation, which is both a reflection of her generosity and, I have come to understand, a reflection of the fact that she processed most of it in real time rather than storing it up, dealt with the feelings as they arose rather than accumulating them into something that would eventually require a reckoning, which is what I do and which is why retirement has been the reckoning that it has been. I am not crushed by any of this, And I do not want this to sound like a man being crushed by his own history, because that is not what it is. What it is, more precisely, is a man in his late 60s, sitting with the full and honest account of a life he lived mostly well and partly imperfectly, acknowledging the imperfections with the seriousness they deserve, rather than the minimization that would be easier, because the minimization would be a disservice to the people who absorb the costs of those imperfections, and who deserved better accounting than I gave them at the time. Somewhere around the 8-month mark, I had a conversation with Linda that I think of as the moment when the searching became intentional rather than accidental, when I stopped waiting for purpose to show up on its own, and started actually going looking for it, with the same deliberateness I had brought to building a football program from scratch in my mid-30s, which had required patience and honesty about what was not working, and a willingness to try things that felt uncomfortable before they felt natural. Linda had come home from the hospital on a Thursday evening and found me in the armchair in the study with the television on and a book face down on the side table that I had clearly not been reading, and a general air about me that she later described as a man waiting for something to happen to him. And she sat down across from me and said straight and without any particular gentleness, because she knows that gentleness sometimes lets me off the hook too easily, that she was worried about me and that she thought I needed to stop treating retirement something was happening to me, and start treating it like something was happening to a me. I did not respond well initially, which is my default response when someone is accurate about something I have been avoiding, but I sat with it overnight, and by the next morning I recognized it as the most useful thing anyone had said to me since I retired. And I told her so over coffee, and she said she knew and that I was welcome, and we moved on in the practical way that long marriages handle the moments when one person has said something true and the other person has finally heard it. The first thing I did was call Danny Briggs, my former assistant coach, and ask if I could come in and watch practice a couple of times a week. Not as a coach, not with any authority or official role, just as an observer and a resource if the staff wanted to bounce things off me. Danny talked to Coach Harlan, and Coach Harlan called me himself the next day and said he would be glad to have me around and that he had some questions about the program's history and some of the schemes we had run that he would genuinely value my input on. And I want to tell you that the first practice I attended in that capacity, standing on the sideline in a plain jacket with no whistle and no clipboard, watching the drills run with the cool air coming across the field and no clipboard, watching the drills run with the cool outdoor air coming across the field and the familiar sounds of pads and whistles and coaches calling correction. It was good and it was hard in equal measure. Good because I was back in a context that felt like home, and hard because the home had new furniture and a new owner, and I was a guest in it rather than the man who had built it. And holding both of those things at the same time required a maturity that I was not always sure I had managed successfully in the moment, but that I got better at over time. I kept going to practices twice a week through the rest of the season, and the relationship with Coach Harlan developed into something genuine and mutually useful. A younger coach with good instincts and less historical context, and an older one with plenty of context and no authority to impose it, which turned out to be a combination that worked well for both of us. I also went back to the classroom, not as a teacher, but as something adjacent to it, through a program that the school district ran that placed retired educators in schools as volunteer mentors and tutors for students who were struggling academically. I signed up for 2 mornings a week at a middle school about 3 miles from the house, working with 7th and 8th graders who needed help with reading comprehension and basic writing skills. And I want to be honest about the first few weeks of it, because the honesty is instructive. The first few weeks were humbling in a way I had not anticipated. Not because the work was too difficult, but because I kept approaching it with the habits of a high school teacher and a football coach, which are habits built around authority and expertise and the assumption that the person in front of you is going to respond to a clear and confident delivery of information. And 7th graders who are struggling academically have a very different relationship with authority and expertise than high school juniors who have chosen to be in your classroom. And I had to unlearn a significant amount of my default approach toward being usual to have of them. They were dodav, tuverdav epidav, Rebecca amserd retwid vidons, ribos tom edi beons, widitimidod brion ritamite, witon meant bedam might it beon, a witty mind be of feasible, Widemity was not interested in working with me or with anyone else who reminded him of a teacher, and I recognized the resistance because I had seen versions of it for 35 years, but the version I was seeing now was sharper and more personal and required a different response than the classroom authority. I would have deployed at Riversance and Morted Court and Vedon Beyite. By the sixth session, Deshawn and I had found something that worked between us, not a dramatic breakthrough, but a functional and genuine working relationship, built on his discovery that I was not going to give up on him, and my discovery that his resistance was not personal and was not permanent, and was not something that needed to be overcome so much as waited out, with patience and consistency. He started making real progress around the 10th session, and I felt the specific and irreplaceable satisfaction of watching a young person move through a difficulty that had been blocking them, and the feeling was different from the classroom satisfaction I had known at Riverside, smaller in scale and more intimate, and in some ways more direct, and I held on to it with both hands, because I recognized it as the thing I had been looking for without knowing precisely what I was looking for. Linda noticed the change in me before I fully noticed it did. Mrs. Tipple Biskipple, for her, and she said one even in a rave, that I seemed more like myself than I had since I retired, and I thought about that and recognized it as accurate, and thought about what had changed, and understood that what had changed was not that I had found a replacement for the career, but that I had found a way to keep doing the essential thing that the career had always been a vehicle, which was being genuinely useful to a young person who needed something I to give, and the finding of that way, impersic and persically, and one eed ins font and mad, to the dumb. What did I get it died? Did it identify? I cannot give you a clean date for when the shift happened, because it did not happen on a date. It happened the way seasons change in Tennessee, gradually and then all at once, and then gradually again, the temperature moving in one direction overall, even while individual days went back and forth in ways that kept you from being entirely certain the change had actually arrived, until you looked back across enough of them to see the pattern clearly. What I can tell you is that sometime in the second year of retirement, without any single dramatic moment of resolution, the mornings began to feel different in a way that I noticed first as an absence. Specifically, the absence of that hollow, deflating sensation that had greeted me every day for the better part of a year when I woke up and remembered that the school day was starting without me. The sensation did not disappear entirely, and I am not sure it ever will entirely, but it thinned out and became less constant and less heavy, and the mornings that were free of it began to outnumber the mornings that were not, and on the mornings that were free of it the day had a quality to it that I want to try to describe accurately, because I think the accuracy matters more than making it sound better than it was. The days did not feel triumphant or arrived at in any grand sense. They felt ordinary in a way that was different from the painful ordinariness of the difficult months, a quieter and more settled kind of ordinary, the ordinary of a Tuesday morning with a reason to get up and somewhere to be by 9 and the cup of coffee that tasted good and a wife moving around in the kitchen and a boy named Deshawn who was going to be in a chair across from me in 2 hours expecting me to show up and help him work through something hard. The Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the middle school had become the fixed architecture of my week in a way that nothing else had managed to become, and I had been going long enough that the relationship with Deshawn and 2 other students I had been assigned had built up the kind of history and trust that makes the work feel real rather than performed, and the realness of it was what mattered, what had been missing for so long, and what made the mornings that contained it feel fundamentally different from the mornings that did not. I had a conversation with Linda in the early spring of the second year that I think of as the closest thing to a turning point I could identify in the whole process, not because anything was resolved in it, but because something was named in it that had been unnamed, and that the naming of it helped in the way that naming difficult things sometimes helps, not by changing them, but by changing your relationship to them. We were sitting on the back porch on a warm April evening, the kind of sendidium, with Tangeriven, with Taman, Averweda, betade a Roman saint, and I said out loud for the first time what I had been carrying internally since the football game in September of my first retirement, what I had been carrying internally since the football game in September of my first retirement year, which was that the hardest thing about retiring from teaching was not the loss of the job, but the loss of the renewal, The fact that September would never agree with students who needed what I had, and who would be given, and would be quick would tie. Linda was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that I have turned over many times since, which was that she thought the renewal had not stopped. It had just changed scale, and that Deshaun was a renewal, and Coach Harlan asking me questions after practice was a renewal, and the conversations we were having now that I was actually home and actually present were a renewal, and that maybe the mistake was measuring all of it against the scale of 35 years of September mornings rather than taking each one as what it was, which was enough. I sat with that for a long time after she said it, sitting in the warm April evening with the tree line going green in front of me, and I recognized the truth of it with the particular feeling of recognizing something that has been true for a while, and that you have been circling around without landing on it directly. The acceptance that came, and it did come, slowly and without fanfare, and without any single clean moment of arrival, was the acceptance of a different scale, rather than the acceptance of defeat, and the difference between those two things turned out to be significant. I was not a lesser version of the man I had been at 50, running a football program and filling a classroom with 30 years of accumulated expertise and the particular authority of a man at the peak of his professional life. I was a different version, operating at a different register, and the different register had its own integrity and its own sufficient value that did not require comparison to what had come before in order to be real. I was 67 years old, and Deshaun was reading at grade level for the first time, and the back porch was warm in the April evening, and Linda was beside me, and the tree line was green, and that was, I had finally come to understand, genuinely and completely enough. Let me talk to you straight for a few minutes, the way I would talk to a friend sitting across from me at a diner booth over coffee on a slow weekday morning. Not the polished kind of advice that comes from someone who has figured everything out and is generously sharing the view from the top, but the plain, honest kind that comes from a man who went through something difficult and specific and who made enough mistakes in it to form some genuine opinions about what he would do differently, and what he would tell someone else if they were heading into the same territory, and he had the chance to say something useful before they got there. If you are between 50 and 70 and something in this story has felt true to something you are living or approaching or watching someone you love navigate, then I think you probably already know most of what I am going to say. But I have found over 35 years of teaching that knowing something and hearing it said aloud by someone who learned it the hard way are two different experiences, and sometimes the hearing is what makes the knowing stick in a way it has not stuck before. The first thing I want to say is about the identity that work builds inside you over decades, because I think this is the thing that most men my age are least prepared for and most reluctant to talk about honestly, and the reluctance costs them time and difficulty that a little honest conversation in advance might have reduced. I built my entire sense of who I was inside, 35 years of teaching and coaching, and I built it so completely and so thoroughly that when the teaching and coaching ended, I discovered that I did not have a clear answer to the question of who I was without them, and that question was not going to be answered by taking long walks or reorganizing the garage or watching afternoon television, which is what I tried first and which did not work, and which I suspect is what a lot of men try first for the same insufficient reasons. The question requires actual examination, honest and patient, and without the defensiveness that makes it easy to avoid, and the examination is better done before retirement removes the professional structure that makes the avoidance feel reasonable. If you are still working and you are hearing this, the most genuinely useful thing I can suggest is to spend some time now, while the job is still providing the daily answer to the identity question, thinking carefully about who you are outside of what you do, what you value, and what engages you, and what kind of contribution you want to be making to the world, when the professional contribution is no longer available, because that person is going to be standing in your kitchen on the first Monday of your retirement, and the better you know him in advance, the less disorienting that Monday is going to be. The second thing I want to say is about the particular grief of losing something that renews itself, and I say this specifically for the teachers and the coaches and the nurses and the social workers and the others who spent their careers in work that was organized around ongoing relationships with people who needed them. Because I think the retirement transition looks different for those people who needed them. Because I think the retirement transition looks different for those people whose careers were organized around projects or systems. And the difference does not get talked about. When your career is built around relationships with people who need you, and those relationships renew themselves on a regular cycle, retirement does not just end a job. It ends a cycle of renewal that your entire emotional and psychological life has been organized around, and the ending of that cycle is a specific kind of loss that is different from and in some ways harder than the general loss of professional identity that all retirees face. If this is your situation, I want you to know that the grief is real and proportionate and not a sign that something has gone wrong, and that the path through it is not to find a single replacement that replicates the scale and the renewal of the career, but to build a collection of smaller connections and engagements that individually provide what the career provided collectively, and to be patient with how long that building takes and how different the result looks from what you started with. The third thing is about marriage and partnership in retirement. And I say it with the specific emphasis of a man who was married to someone considerably wiser than himself about human beings and who leaned on that wisdom more than he adequately acknowledged during the difficult months. Your partner has watched you go through this transition from closer range than anyone else, and has observations about what you're experiencing that are probably more accurate than your own. And the willingness to hear those observations without defensiveness is one of the more useful skills you can bring to the retirement transition, and also one of the harder ones for men of our generation who were raised to figure things out on our own, and to regard the needing of another person's perspective as something adjacent to weakness, which it is not. It is intelligence, and the sooner you figure that out, the transico in a go. And the last thing, the one I will leave you with, because it is the one I most wish someone had said to me before that first September came and went without a new classroom to walk into, is that the renewal does not stop when the career stops. It just changes scale, and the changing of scale is not a diminishment unless you decide it is, and deciding it is not will be one of the more important decisions of your retired life, and it is entirely yours to make. It is a Thursday morning, as I sit here telling you all of this, and in about 2 hours I am going to drive to the middle school and sit across from Deshawn and Chuan and 2 other kids who have been working with me for the better part of a year now, and I am looking forward to it in the specific and unflashy way that I have come to recognize as one of the more reliable feelings in my retired life. Not the adrenalive, that's something quieter and more durable than either of those things, the steady warmth of showing up for something that needs you to show up, and knowing that you are going to bear, and scoring at Storytime, but alrat milu witwordieds, that appropriation should every predicate. And that it is realities, pravers that of these many gibbs. He would duros and proletivacaud. He were Tom was reaving with the drusives. Their pertomity proud, and the back of the lot, showing the lat as you'll either through the window, with the tree line at the back of the vot, showing the lass of fall color, a few stubborn reds and yellows hanging on against the gray of the Noe be the toe. Agat, bitter about 20 minutes, just 3 watts. People boswees. Double with the beer count. Your phone with its beer count. Rebecca fall under the beer. Linda left for the hospital about 45 minutes ago, her morning shift starting at 7, and the house has the particular settled quiet of a weekday morning after the person you live with has gone to work, a quiet that I have made a certain peace with, even if I have not made a complete peace with it, and I sit in it now without the hollow feeling that characterized the same quiet during the difficult months of the first year, without the sense of a room where something used to live that does not live there anymore. The room is the same room. The quiet is the same quiet. What has changed is me, or more precisely, what has changed is my relationship to the quiet, my ability to sit in it without immediately measuring it against the noise that used to fill the same hours and finding it lacking by the comparison. I think about the man I was 2 years ago sitting on this same back port, what a March. I would might about to mo fission that wrapped with, and another was a web part of reneries. I would have fission of the self that was going through something he did not yet have aid enough to understanding to navigate, and I want to say to him what I could is under something that did not yet have the understanding to navigate, and I want to say to him what I could not say to him then, which is that what you are losing and what you are grieving is real, and the grief is proportionate, and the difficulty of ease, in the spacing go, it a codec did with this not, what the kiakamets be it, you the code it's kite, did a that short retrob won't bead, which ris for a car babies. Then we have an eba meter beams a be and you and we dave. Fanas of sambit worthen, ratar reomot, be breeding retins. The rackene being this frozen 3-5 years of classrooms, the expression of a young person who has just discovered that they are capable of something they did not previously believe they were capable of. And I sat across from him and said, "Good job, man," and meant it with everything I had, and the meaning of it dot require, and did not require any carade needs, but and the toiletry count of the bleed. Bat great sip by scout the goat. I am 67 years old, and the coffee is warm and the light through the window is doing that particular thing with the morning that it does in the fall, and in 2 hours I am going to drive across town and sit across from a kid who is learning something real, and I am going to be useful to him in a way that is genuine and direct and entirely sufficient. And that is the life I have, and it is enough. And the enough of it is not a consolation. It is the actual thing, and I know the difference now in a way I did not know it. It cost me to arrive at it. If you have stayed with me all the way through this, through the September morning on the back porch, and the football game in the press box, and the kitchen table in the dark, and the slow and uneven process of finding something real to hold on to on the other side of all of it, then I want you to know that your company through this story has meant something genuine to me. Something I do not say as a formality, or as the kind of thing you say at the end of a story, because it is expected. There is something about telling the honest version of something, the version without the polished edges and the comfortable resolution, that requires a listener who is willing to sit with the unpolished version, and you have been that, and I am grateful for it in a plain and real way. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with one question, just one, asked without any agenda behind it, except the honest hope that it might be worth sitting with, if you are anywhere near the season of life I have been describing, or if you love someone who is. The question is this: what is the thing in your life right now that renews you, that gives you back something essential every time you engage with it, that makes the next morning feel like it has a reason to begin? And do you know clearly enough what that thing is that you would recognize its absence if it was suddenly gone? I ask that because I did not know clearly enough, did not examine it closely enough while I had it, took the renewal for granted, the way you take most essential things for granted until they are no longer available, and the not knowing cost me the better part of a year of difficulty that a little honest self-examination in advance might have shortened considerably. If something in this story felt true to something you are carrying or something you can see coming down the road, I hope it helped to hear it said out loud by someone who has been in the same quiet house on the same silent Monday morning, trying to figure out where in the heck his sense of purpose had gone, and who found his way, slowly and imperfectly, to something worth getting up for. If you would like to hear more stories like this one, honest and unhurried and told from the inside of a real American life, it would mean a real lot if you would consider subscribing to this channel, not because the number matters for its own sake, but because every person who subscribes is saying that this kind of storytelling is worth continuing, and that quiet encouragement is what makes the continuing possible. Thank you for being here with me today. You take good care of yourself out there.